attending our United Way of Rutherford and Cannon Counties Bold Goals Lunch and Learn. My name's Dan Caldwell, and I am the Vice President of Collective Impact and Strategic Initiatives here at United Way. And we are so pleased to have you join us this afternoon for our Lunch and Learn. We have two wonderful speakers. We've got Connie Casha, who is the Director of Early Learning Programs over at MTSU, and Jen Croft, who is the Director of Child Wellbeing with the Tennessee Commission on Children and Youth. So just a few logistical items. We set this up as a webinar. So what you'll see on your screen is the active speaker and or the slide presentation. So Connie and Jen have some slides that they'll present. Kind of by default, the webinar puts everyone on mute just to kind of minimize distractions. But please feel free to use the chat. We'll be monitoring the chat. I think there may be some time for some Q&A toward the latter end of the session. So I am going to turn it over to Connie, and she's gonna kick off our activity. So thank you for joining.
Okay, thank you, Dan. Thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. As Dan said, I'm Connie Casha. I'm the Director of Early Learning Programs at Middle Tennessee State University. I've been an advocate for young children for as long as I can remember, probably since I was a child myself. And my work has been over 25 years. So again, thank you for joining us to hear about our topic, about our children and our families. United Way of Rutherford and Cannon County has identified 3 bold goals for 2030. Early education is one of these goals, and I'm excited that I was given the opportunity to co-chair along with Dr. Lana Sievers on the Vision Council on Early Childhood Development here in Rutherford County. So while we have met only once this year, or since we started, I guess, our first meeting was in December, the knowledge, enthusiasm, and support that was shared through our Zoom call was just absolutely amazing and very exciting. I know that good things will happen as a result of this work, and by supporting the needs of the whole child, we will raise that percentage of young children entering kindergarten healthy and ready to achieve to the best of their ability. So as a state, Tennessee has been engaged in conversations over the past 3, could be 4 years. Jen can confirm that for me. Raising awareness of how each and every one of us plays a role in supporting and understanding of how we build strong brains, as well as prevent, protect, and support anyone facing or being impacted by adversity. So through this project, I have come to better know my colleague here, Jen Drake-Croft, and I'm excited that she has agreed to talk with us today about the science of brain development and what we can do to support early childhood development, because it is something that all of us play a role in. Jen is with the Tennessee Commission on Children and Youth and was a co-creator of the first materials developed for the Building Strong Brains and the Impact of Adverse Childhood Experiences project. I'm going to turn it over to Jen because she's got lots of great things to share with us. After her presentation, we'll have time for some questions, and I will also share another learning opportunity that you will have at the end of this week. So Jen, take us into this great information.
Thank you so much, Connie. You all can hear me fine, right? Okay, good deal.
Perfect.
Connie is one of the first people that I met with when I came to the state 5 years ago, and I just keep learning from her. She is such a wealth of knowledge, both in terms of policy and practice, and you all are lucky to have her as your co-chair. So yeah, like she said, I'm the Director of Child Wellbeing at the Tennessee Commission on Children and Youth. If you all are not familiar with TCCY, we are an independent state agency that works to improve systems and policies that benefit all children, youth, and young adults. And we also have have 9 regional councils throughout the state. Susan Cope is oversees our regional council for the Mid-Cumberland area. So if you need her contact information, feel free to email me and I'll connect you, but likely many of you already know her. So I'm going to go ahead and get started and tell you all a little bit about the mission of Building Strong Brains Tennessee. So our effort is to change the culture in our state so that our overarching policies, philosophy, programs, and practices for children, youth, and young adults use the latest brain science to prevent and mitigate the impact of adverse childhood experiences. We know that healthy child development is the foundation for educational achievement, economic productivity, responsible citizenship, and lifelong health. And this comes from a variety of backgrounds, whether it's economics, microbiology, genetics. All of these areas show the same thing, that in order to have these outcomes, we need to invest in healthy child development and create a strong foundation for future health. We know that these 4 pillars that you see listed on the screen lead to successful parenting of the next generation, which ultimately lead to the building of strong communities and a healthy economy. So if you've heard me present before, or you ever do in the future, you will always hear me say that I argue that everybody cares about healthy child development, no matter what their personal or professional passion is. And even if they don't like children, right? Because everybody cares about, crime in their community, or they may care about their local economy. They may care about heart disease prevention. And at the very least, people care about the safety of themselves and their family, right? And so even if you don't like kiddos, you have a stake in ensuring that every child in your community has the opportunity to develop strong brain architecture and a foundation for health, because ultimately we are interconnected and it affects all of our well-being. So you've heard me say that the foundation of health is built in the earliest years of life. And a big reason for that is because of all of the brain development that happens in the first 3 years, really, but also, there's a sensitive period up until 5 years. And so what you see here on this screen are these neural connections that represent the brain building or the brain architecture in these earliest years of life. So you see at a newborn, we have some connections, 6 months, we have a lot more, but at 2 years, we have these dense connections. And if you've never thought about it before, if you look at a 2 or 3 year old kid, they have a big head for such a little body. They're almost adult sized heads. They look like bobblehead dolls. And this is because by the time you are 3 years old, 85 to 90% of brain volume is developed. Now, that doesn't mean that brain development is over. It just means that in terms of the actual volume of the brain, we have grown considerably and we're almost to adult size. And so this really represents all these neural connections that are forming. And we know that not only genes play a role in forming these neural connections, but really experiences in the environment contribute to brain development and growth. So we know that the early years of life matter because early experiences affect the architecture of the maturing brain. As it emerges, the quality of that architecture establishes either a sturdy or a fragile foundation for all of the development and behavior that follows. So getting things right the first time is easier than trying to fix them later. What you see here is an image of a house. And because when we think about architecture, we think about buildings or homes, right? And when we think about the first steps in building a home, we can think about laying the foundation, which is often considered one of the more simple structures of the building, not as complex necessarily as the framing or the wiring or the plumbing. And yet, if we don't get that foundation laid correctly, it's going to compromise all of these other parts of the home, right? That show up later, maybe within a year or maybe within 15 years, right? And so we may see cracks in the drywall, uneven floors, roofs leaking, doors that won't shut. And it tells us that there might be an issue with the foundation. And so when we think about early brain development as laying the foundation for future brain development, we can think about these symptoms emerging that look like addiction, relationship issues, ability to control one's impulses, and understanding and managing your emotions, or having good mental health in the future. And so if we are noticing problems in these areas, it lets us know that there might be an issue with the foundation that needs to be repaired. We don't ever just knock over the house. The foundation can always be repaired and support the structure for the long term. So even if we don't get it right the first time, we have the opportunity to repair later. However, it is more cost effective and easier to make sure that we lay the foundation right in the first place. So when we think about how brain development is, or how brains are built and how this foundation is laid, it is through a concept called serve and return interactions. So if you think about a game of volleyball or tennis, somebody is serving the ball to get the game started. And in order to keep the game going, the other person has to return that serve. Similarly, babies, infants, right, and children end up serving to us through a variety of ways where they are seeking interaction, whether that's through crying, babbling, facial expressions and gestures, and healthy adults respond in kind. We do this, again, if we're healthy and supported, we do this really naturally. If you've ever been in a grocery store and seen a little 2-year-old in the buggy, you might smile, or you might play a game of peekaboo. And we're often drawn to these back and forth interactions, and we don't think very much of them. If you have ever had a baby or been around a new baby, a newborn, you'll notice that they cry, and almost every cry sounds the same in the beginning. And we instinctually go to figure out what's going on. Are they hungry? Do they need to be, bounced up and down in a rhythmic way? Do they need a diaper change, right? And so because we do these things really intuitively, we often don't think about the purpose beyond meeting immediate needs. But there's a lot that's going on in these interactions beyond the obvious. So if you think, for instance, about a crying baby and a parent or caregiver who goes to meet their needs, that baby is learning lots of things about their world. They're learning, A, I can trust this adult to take care of me. B, a lot of times they're being exposed to language, right? We naturally narrate for babies and children, where we'll say, oh goodness, you were so hungry, right? Here is some milk. Oh, that makes you feel so good in your tummy. You were hangry, you were hungry and angry at the same time, right? And so we do this stuff, and we are teaching children about their internal states, their external world. We're giving them the names for things, right? You don't learn the name for milk or a bottle or diaper or mommy or daddy without these back and forth interactions. And all the while, neural circuitry is being formed and building this strong foundation. So, babies, of course, don't just cry, but when we respond effectively, you'll notice that babies start to have different cries for different needs, and we are able to read into that. Or we see babies social smile at 6 weeks, and we smile back and talk to them and tell them how cute they are and beautiful. Later on, we notice a pointing and a that, right? And we'll say, oh yes, that is a leaf, on a tree. Or I I always remember having to bring my child along for a presentation I gave. And when she was 2, she pointed at a projector and I said, yeah, that's a projector and this is what it does. So children are learning all about their worlds through these very vital serve and return interactions that are essential for the development of healthy brain circuits. Therefore, when we think about the bold work that you're doing, we know that systems that support the quality of relationships in early care settings, communities, and homes also support the development of sturdy brain architecture. And that quality relationships, I don't want anybody to get the wrong idea and think, after 3 or after 5, relationships aren't important. They are. They continue to be vital in adolescence in order to reinforce brain architecture and build resilience. So I'm going to take a moment to expound on that last point and say that our brain development doesn't end until our mid-20s, right? That's where we start to see the final, more complex skills being built in terms of our air traffic control system, so to speak, or our ability to, regulate our mood, control impulses, understand consequences. And I jokingly tell people all the time that car insurance companies had this figured out long before brain scientists did. They could see that there was a big difference between an 18-year-old or even a 21-year-old behind the wheel of a car versus a 26-year-old, which is why we see our insurance rates drop so much after we turn 26 years old. It's because that's when we have sort of cemented many of these skills and finished our development. But what we can think about in terms of those earliest years is this is where we're building the volume and where we're laying the stage for more complex skills to build on top. So when you're thinking about a house, I mean, I live in Nashville, you guys live in, many of you live in Murfreesboro or around, you see buildings and new houses popping up everywhere. And you notice that all of a sudden a house is up, right? But then it seems like it takes forever to get it completed. So the volume or the space that house is taking up doesn't change, but there's all of the things that are happening inside the house, right? The more complex things that are being put in, whether it be the wiring, the electricity, the plumbing, the fixtures. And so we can think about brain development happening in the same way in adolescence. And in those older years, we see refinement, we see pruning, we see more connections between lobes of the brain. And so these quality relationships continue to support those features as well. What derails healthy brain development? We know that stress, in particular toxic stress, is what often derails or puts cracks in the foundation for future development. So I want to quickly define these different levels of stress for you, because not all stress is created equal and some stress is good for us. We don't want to protect children from all stress, right? We just want to protect them from severe stress. So when we think about positive stress, we're thinking about short stressful events like meeting new people, starting the first day of school, trying out for the soccer team, getting an immunization. These are healthy for brain development. They prepare the brain and body for stressful situations later in life, okay? So oftentimes we can think about it being like a peak of stress, and then it goes down relatively quickly and we go back down to baseline. We can liken this to taking Advil or any other medication, that if we take 2 Advil, it's healthy for us. It relieves our symptoms and doesn't do long-term damage. If we took a bottle of Advil, it would really hurt our body. It would be a toxic level, and we would need to get our stomach pumped in the hospital, best case scenario, right? And so stress is the same way. Short doses, healthy, fine. Large doses start to wear and tear on many systems in the body, including the developing brain. So there's a next level of stress, which is called tolerable stress. This stress really represents those things that happen to us that are tragic and often unavoidable, like a death in the family or a natural disaster. And while they're not good for us, if we have supportive caregivers around to be in our corner to let us know that they're going to take care of us and it's all going to be okay, we can buffer this stress response and keep it from getting to a toxic level, right? And that those events won't do lasting damage to the brain or body. We are in a really unique time right now in a pandemic where, yeah, I've heard the metaphor, we're all in the rain, right? But we all have different boats. So some of us have really stable boats that can withstand the storm, but some of us have boats that are leaky, small, and don't weather well in the storm. And so similarly, every child in the world is being impacted by this pandemic right now. But some children, but they are being impacted differently, right? Because the children that have those caregivers in their corner that help manage anxiety, that help manage all the transitions of going to in-person school and to online school, all of the things and stressors that come with this pandemic. This is going to be a tolerable stressor for those children. For children where this decreases their ability to have access to food, or it increases the vulnerability of their families as a result of decreased income, or children that have to be on online school, but their parents have to be at an essential job and there is no childcare, right? These are events that can potentially be toxic because we're missing a lot of those buffers that would help keep that stress from rising and staying elevated, right? So we're not saying that every person that experiences a stressor is going to have negative lifelong reactions. You'll always remember if a parent dies, right? But if you had lots of adults in your life to support you, that event is not going to be damaging to your brain or body. The same event could happen to another child where they don't have those supports, and the stress of the situation without having someone in your corner, without knowing it's going to be safe, does create those toxic levels that create ongoing and repeated damage. So when we think about abuse, neglect, parental addiction, and other issues, we often see that these stress hormones damage developing structures in the child's brain, and the result is an increased vulnerability to lifelong physical and mental health problems, including addiction. I used to work in child abuse prevention, and when I would talk to folks about abuse, they had in their minds images of children with black eyes, or maybe they had in their mind thoughts of sexual abuse. But very rarely could people really wrap their minds around the concept of neglect. And a big piece of that is because we can't really see neglect. We don't exactly understand how it impacts or hurts a child. We can kind of say, oh, it wouldn't be good to not have your parents around, but what kind of lasting damage is that going to create? So this image in front of you is one that helps people understand the incredibly toxic impact of sustained or prolonged neglect on a child's developing brain. So you see these two PET scans. On your left, you see the brain scan of a healthy 3-year-old child, one that was raised with maybe minimal adversity and lots of safe, stable, nurturing, interactive relationships. And you see a lot of activity in that brain, lots of heated, hot colors showing and representing the architecture that's present. Specifically, they are pointing out in this slide the temporal lobes and the lack of activity of the temporal lobes in the brain to your right. So to give you a bit more context to this brain that you're seeing on your right, this is the brain of a child who was raised in a Romanian orphanage in the 90s. For those of you who are unfamiliar with that scenario, the caregiver-child ratio was horrible. There were so few caregivers and so many kids in these orphanages that those quality serve and return interactions simply were not present. Babies and children were responded to on a schedule. If you think about the needs of a baby, they were fed on a schedule, diapers changed on a schedule, etc. And I'm not saying that schedules are bad for babies, but if a baby has spoiled themselves, they don't need to wait 3 hours to get their diaper changed, right? So these babies and small children learned early on that their bids for attention, their cries, their any serve that they generated were not going to be returned. And they were missing this back and forth essential interaction with caregivers. What you see is a lack of activity in the temporal lobes as a result of that extreme deprivation in infancy. And we know that the temporal lobes regulate emotions and receive input from the senses. And that helps us with our emotional regulation and cognitive development. And if we don't have those things, we see emotional and cognitive problems down the line. So while most children are not being neglected at that level, some are in the United States, still many children are experiencing various forms of neglect from caregivers, whether it be because of stress, whether it be because of mental health issues, lack of support from community, or addiction, right? Where they have this absence of these serve and return interactions. And even though we wouldn't see this stark impact, we do see the impact on lots of developing brain structures that help children function and thrive in settings like school and as they grow in the workplace. I referenced the air traffic control system in the brain earlier. I know a lot of you are involved in early childhood issues or are teachers, and so you're probably familiar with the term executive functioning. But we use air traffic control as a metaphor to help people who are not in your positions understand the concept of executive functioning, which is that group of skills that helps us focus on multiple streams of information at the same time, set goals, make plans, make decisions in light of available information, revise plans, and resist hasty actions. So just like an air traffic control tower, where we are making sure that planes take off and land in a way that doesn't lead to them colliding, right? Executive functioning operates in the same way. And we also, if you think about an air traffic control center, if the weather changes or if any other thing, if there's an electrical issue with the plane, it's going to change the flight patterns and the needs of every other plane. And we have to adapt again in order for there not to be these collisions. As children are growing from the time they're in infancy all the way to they're in their mid-20s, they are developing these executive functioning skills. And so we can't expect a 2-year-old to be able to set goals, make plans, right? Or even be able to adapt to changes that are happening in their environment very well, right? If you have changed plans on a 2-year-old or a 4-year-old or even a 6-year-old, you can notice a bit of a meltdown, right? So we, through these serve and return interactions, are helping build these skills in children, youth, and young adults so that they can master them and have a strong air traffic control center that will help them in school and in employment and make good decisions about their life that impact their own health and relationships. So you can see that executive functioning is a key biological foundation for school readiness, as well as outcomes in health and employability. And although there are sensitive periods of development, again, those periods where it's easier to build it than to fix it later, we know that we can fix executive function or build it out later on in adults through various programs or through support. And a lot of times when we are working with adults who do not have a lot of these skills, it helps us know that there are some foundation issues or some skill gaps that need to be supported. Moving on to the adverse childhood experiences study, and I'm aware that I'm flying through these slides, so please, I will give you all my email at the end, and you can feel free to email me with any questions that you may have. But the adverse childhood experiences study was one that was conducted in the mid-90s by Kaiser Permanente, which is a large healthcare organization that provides both physical and mental health care, as well as health insurance. And they largely exist on the West Coast, though I think that we have a few sites in the Southeast. So we had a physician who was affiliated with Kaiser Permanente in San Diego connect with a physician who worked for the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. And they started to compare notes on this sort of anecdotal evidence that they'd been noting in patients and a relationship between early childhood adversity, or even just childhood adversity, doesn't have to be early, and the development of depression and, in this instance, specifically depression and overeating later in life in adulthood. So the two of them came together, decided to execute this study where they asked a series of 10 questions. Let me see if I've got the questions up here. Of course I don't. So there were 5 questions about abuse and neglect. So physical abuse, emotional abuse, physical neglect, emotional neglect, and sexual abuse, and 5 types of household dysfunction, which included having a parent who abused substances, having a parent who was incarcerated, having a parent who experienced mental health issues, having your mother be a victim of domestic violence, or having your parents divorced, right? And so this 10-question questionnaire was distributed to 17,000 patients who were a part of the Kaiser Permanente San Diego system. For those of you who are wonks like me and enjoy research, you know that 17,000 people is a huge sample size. And so when they administered this questionnaire, everybody has a score between 0 and 10. Either you've had none of these experiences happen to you, or you've had all 10 of the experiences happen to you. And given the unique position that Kaiser was in to look at the health records and eventual death records of patients, they were able to see that there was a graded dose response between the number of adverse childhood experiences you had, any of them, any combination, and the development of troubling health risk behaviors, leading diseases, including 9 out of 10 of our leading diseases here in America, United States of America, and also life potential. So things like graduation rates, academic achievement, lost time from work. They really saw this tipping point being at 4 or more. So if you had 4 or more ACEs, there was a very strong relationship with an increased risk in developing heart disease, for example, or being a smoker, or not graduating high school, okay? We like to say that this is fact, not fate. Meaning that it does increase the risk. And at the population level, we see these strong relationships, but that doesn't mean that everybody with a higher ACE score is going to have negative outcomes, because there are things that buffer and mitigate the impact of those ACEs, and lots of things that change the way in which they are affecting the brain and body, including the stage you're in development. We know that having a lot of these adversities in the earliest years leads to particular challenging, particular damage that is challenging and more far-reaching, right? So if you experience all 4 of your ACEs in the first 3 years of life, or 8 ACEs in the first 3 years of life, because of all that rapid brain development that's occurring, it's going to affect many different functions in the brain. It's going to affect the foundation for future development of skills, as well as many other systems in the body. Versus if you experience all of your ACEs after the age of 10, they're still going to have an impact on you, but it's not going to be as severe or far-reaching, because you have already developed a strong foundation and have more coping skills to manage to manage stress that's coming your way. Again, you still have negative outcomes, they're just not as severe. So when you get to the individual level, there is lots of variation. You can have 2 people with the exact same ACE score and even have the exact same specific adverse childhood experiences and have very different outcomes depending on the safe, stable, nurturing relationships and environments that were or were not available to them, the interventions that were or were not available to them, and the timing of when these things occurred. So just know that, the ACE questionnaire is by no means a diagnostic tool. It is a tool that helps us better understand risk. So when the original co-investigators were trying to understand the relationship between ACEs and the problems they were seeing later on in life, they developed this pyramid, this schematic, to help them make sense of each step along the way. So what you see at the bottom of the pyramid are ACEs themselves. We know that when we have a higher number of ACEs, it leads to this disrupted neurodevelopment, as we talked about before. And then this disrupted neurodevelopment can lead to social, emotional, and cognitive impairments. So if you have, for instance, a kindergartner or first grader who is coming into the classroom who did not have a strong foundation laid and who is suffering from these social, emotional, and cognitive impairments, oftentimes the way that behavior is read is that this is a bad kid who refuses to follow the rules. And so as a small child, you're already learning that, things are not safe in my world at home, and things are not safe here at school, and I'm a bad person that can't make good choices, and on and on and on. And so both school and home become stressful environments that project negative messages. You can imagine that if you were dealing with lots of stress day in and day out, as you got older, you would adopt some health risk behaviors, whether it is overeating to self-soothe, whether it is abusing substances, picking up cigarettes, having unprotected and casual sex, anything that you can think of that's a health risk behavior. We see these children be more at risk of engaging in because they want to escape stress just like the rest of us. The difference is that while we all have some unhealthy ways that we cope with stress, whether it's, eat an entire chocolate bar or something like that, a lot of us also have we've had healthy things, ways of dealing with stress modeled for us. And we've had the opportunity to build strong brain architecture that increases the internal capacity to deal with stress. So we might go for a walk, we might talk to a friend, we might think about a situation differently. We might say, you know what, this is challenging now, but it's not going to be around forever. And what have I learned from this, right? But children and adults who have not had that model for them, that don't have that strong neural circuitry, don't have those resources available to them. And so they are seeking to alleviate their stress with what is available, right? So if we start smoking every single day, starting at 11, we know that it increases the chances of developing lung cancer and heart disease and other issues. So we see after this increased adoption of health risk behaviors that there are higher rates of disease, disability, and social problems. I do want to point out that even for those folks who did not adopt health risk behaviors, they still had a stronger relationship with disease and disability and and social problems, but especially disease. And the reason for that is because if we go back to that toxic stress, that it's damaging the developing brain, but it's damaging lots and lots of other systems in the body, right? So if we think about all of the changes that we physically experience when we have stress, we see increased heart rate, right? Or we see tension, or we see inflammation in the body that we know if that is chronically activated, it contributes to disease. So just know that the adoption of these health risk behaviors are insult added to injury, but that the stress itself is damaging lots of these systems in the body and support the pathway to the development of disease. At the end here, or at the tip of this pyramid, you see early death. And so in addition to the 40+ negative outcomes that they saw strong relationships with at the population level, they also saw a strong relationship with early death. So they saw that if you had 4 or more ACEs, you tended to die 5 to 10 years younger. And if you had a subsequent study that was done by the National Institutes of Health, saw that if you had 6 or more ACEs, you tended to die 20 years younger than people with a low or no ACE score. Going up the side here, I don't have the time to dive into epigenetics, but I would encourage you guys, if you're not familiar with the concept, do some Googling. It is fascinating. But epigenetics, in the most basic explanation, are the expression of your genes. They're the turning on and turning off of your genes, or the way that your genes are read and transcribed, right? And so over the course of time, we also know that environmental experiences, including toxic stress, impact genetic expression. And in the case of toxic stress, it often turns on genes that are unhelpful and turns off genes that are helpful. Down the pyramid, you see intergenerational transmission of trauma. And this occurs in a couple of different ways. If you are, if you had a traumatic childhood or a childhood with a lot of adversity, and you don't have good relationship skills, or you cope with your stress through substance use, then when you have children yourself, you are going to have less skills and resources internally and externally available to you that help you engage in these in many cases, challenging but vital serve and return interactions. If you've ever been around a kid for more than 3 hours, you would lose count quickly as to the number of serve and return interactions that go on. But also we see this intergenerational transmission of trauma. We are beginning to see the science point to these epigenetic changes, that they can be passed down to the next generation. And so epigeneticists and geneticists in general are trying to better understand this phenomena, but we are seeing it show up, with survivors, the children of survivors of the Holocaust, as well as other events that have happened in history, looking at their offspring that never experienced the situation firsthand. Many of you, particularly right now, in this time during the pandemic, and this time of lots of conversations and questions about racism and implicit bias, you may be thinking to yourself, those original 10 ACEs don't seem to cover all the sources of toxic stress that a child may experience. And you would be 100% right about that. This, like any field, is an evolving field. We started out with those 10 ACEs, in large part because they were the 10 adversities most experienced by that population served by Kaiser Permanente. So noting that those folks were privately insured, meaning that they had access to resources, that somebody was likely working in their household. And when you looked at the demographics of those folks, most of them were white. Over 75% of them were white. Over 73% of them had at least some college. So when we think about social determinants of health and things that create sources of stress, they were not necessarily the sources of stress experienced by that original population. But as the ACE study was replicated and more was understood about it, they began to converge this science around social determinants of health and things where we have looked at the relationship between these types of adversities and later poor health outcomes. And they decided to add them in to the ACE questionnaire and test them with a more racially and socioeconomically diverse population, which would have been Philadelphia, to see if they had the same effect as those conventional ACEs. And what the study showed is that they indeed did. So things like witnessing violence, living in an unsafe neighborhood, experiencing racism, living in foster care, and experiencing bullying also contribute when you start to stack them up to these poor health outcomes. I want to be very explicit here and say that having one ACE, okay, often is not the problem, right? We're talking about complex trauma here. So the fact that we often list divorce as an ACE concerns many people because we have a high divorce rate in this country. But I want to be clear that having a child who has an ACE score of 1, whose parents divorced, but otherwise has, parents that are strong co-parents, and it has lots of access to safe, stable, nurturing relationships and environments, they are not going to experience toxic stress. When we think about divorce, we're thinking about, and we think about a higher ACE score, we're thinking about sort of a picture of complex trauma and instability. So if we think about a child who had an alcoholic father, who abused her mother physically and maybe sexually abused the daughter when he was drunk, and then the mom was depressed because of the dad's of all this stuff that's happening in the home, and this eventually led to divorce, that paints a very, very different picture. And so you can see that for almost any of these things, seeing these complex layers paints a very different picture. So living in foster care by itself, while it's an adversity, if you didn't have any of these other things and you had lots of supportive adults, it doesn't mean you're going to have a much higher risk of heart disease or have poor outcomes. But you can see many of these things together can contribute to that overload of toxic stress, and again, paints a picture of a lack of safe, stable, nurturing relationships and environments. I mentioned at the very beginning of this presentation that I like to help people see how ACEs and early childhood development impact whatever it is that they care about. And so I kind of help people visualize that through that pillar slide. But this is another visual that complements that looks at the impact of ACEs on lots of issues in our society. So if you have an ACE score of 0 and you suspect that everybody in your family has an ACE score of 0, and maybe everybody in your community has a low ACE score, which you'd probably be wrong because ACEs happen across classes and across socioeconomic status and racial differences. But even if you have an ACE score of 0, you are impacted by the high ACE scores of others in your community. What you see here is an oil spill that represents ACEs themselves. And then you see outcomes, and we just have 10 listed here before I mentioned that there are more than 40, but 10 outcomes that are associated with ACEs. The amount of that oil that's spilled in each of those pie pieces is the amount of that issue that is attributable to a high ACE score. So we're talking about, if we're using painkillers to get high, 54% of that can be attributed to high ACE scores. Serious and persistent mental health issues, 69%, right? Incarceration, 61%. And so all of these issue areas compromise our collective quality of life, our tax dollars, and the health of our state and our community. And so in order to do a better job of not having to spend these dollars and not compromising quality of life on the back end, it means supporting caregivers and children on the front end so that these ACEs can be mitigated, buffered, or never happen at all. And if you think about the billions of dollars we would spend, or that we would save rather, from seeing a decrease in incarceration or a decrease in substance abuse, you understand why it matters to you. Just want to point out that most states in the United States have added the conventional ACE module to something called the Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance Survey. And what you see in Tennessee is that, 61% of people have at least one ACE, and that 28%, or 1 in 4, have 3 or more ACEs. So this is something that really impacts our health outcomes and our social outcomes in our communities. An independent, nonpartisan, what I like to call think tank, they wouldn't call themselves that, but they do a lot of policy analysis and issue analysis. They looked at just 8 outcomes in Tennessee specifically that have a considerable connection to a high ACE score. And then they looked at what that was costing Tennessee. So this is a very conservative estimate, but in 2017, higher ACE scores of 4 or more cost Tennesseans $5.2 billion in medical and worker absenteeism costs. So again, very conservative. There are other ways that ACEs impact costs in our state. And also we know that ACEs impact more than 8 things. But this is what they could cleanly and definitively show in their analysis. All right, I always do this. It's 12:54. But we are going to talk about resilience, because resilience is an important piece of this puzzle, and understanding how we can foster it is going to be critical in how we respond. So the way that we often think about resilience is not what the science tells us. The science tells us that resilience is a dynamic process that is an interplay between genetics and environment. So it's like a teeter-totter. And so what you see is that, yeah, on a teeter-totter, weight matters, right? The more positive outcomes you have, the more, or positive experiences you have, the more likely you're to have positive outcomes, right? And vice versa. But also that genetic component can be thought of as the fulcrum or the scale's tipping point. And so we all have our fulcrums start in different places. If you've had more than one child, you will notice that often that one child is more sensitive than another child, right? Meaning that they're more sensitive to stress. And so it takes it, because of the way their fulcrum is shifted, it takes less effort for the scale to tip towards those negative outcomes. There are also those children that we call our dandelion children that are less sensitive to things in their environment. Their fulcrum's on the other side, making it harder to tip towards the negative outcomes and easier to tip towards positive outcomes. However, we cannot understate the importance of environment in shaping a person's biological ability to be more or less resilient. So not only do we see environment show up on the weighted portions of the scale, but also during critical points in development, including in those earliest years of life, we are able to shape the biology, the internal ability to be more or less resilient. And so you can have a child who is sensitive for whatever reason, very sensitive to stress. And through these nurturing, safe, stable nurturing and consistent interactions with caregivers, we can build biological resilience in them that supports resilience over the long haul and is a resistor to stress. The opposite is true. You can have a child who is born with a temperament and an internal biology that makes them less sensitive to stress, and with lots of adversity and toxic stress, their brain develops and their body becomes wired to be sensitive to stress because it helps us stay protected. So just know that there are profound influences that environment and caregivers in any system can play on building resilience that can impact a person throughout their entire lifespan. The cumulative impact of these life experiences and coping skills, I want to point out, cannot just shift the fulcrum's position during the earliest years of life, but also we can meaningfully shift the fulcrum in adolescence, where the brain is going through a real remodeling period, making it easier to achieve positive outcomes. But even if you've missed these two windows to shift that biological ability to manage or deal with stress, you can still work with adults who have passed these critical periods to tip their scale towards positive outcomes. It's just going to take more effort, as we said before. It's going to take more resources, more positive experiences in order to really weigh that positive side and tip it towards positive outcomes. I want to quickly point out that children of color and children in poverty are more likely to experience systemic barriers to building resilience. So in their communities, they have less access to those resources that offload toxic stress, right? And load the scale with positive experiences and positive relationships. And again, we see this disproportionately happening to children of color. So when we think about our resilience strategies, we have to think about an and both. We have to look at our data and notice those communities, those zip codes, those neighborhoods where children are figuring poorer, because it's going to let us know that we need to invest in providing supports, services, and access to care in those communities so that we can tip the scales toward resilience. You've heard me say safe, stable nurturing over and over again. These are not my words. These come from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention as being essential for positive health outcomes. Okay, I do this all the time. I know we're at our time, but I want to say that in our effort with building strong brains, and what I hope that you all would consider with your effort, is using this science to change these 4 Ps. Philosophy and approach, policies and funding, programs and services, and professional practice. And for some reason, my slide is a little messed up, but what you can see around these 4 Ps are all of these different sectors or entities that we need to be involved in this effort in order to create a foundation for health for children in our community, and to move from this question of what's wrong with you to what's happened to you, so we can get to the root cause of what's driving unhealthy behaviors or poor outcomes and actually make meaningful change. So with that, I will stop. Sorry, Connie, and that I went over a little bit.
Thank you, Jen. It was always, as always, really good information. And every time that I hear, some of it's new, some of it's the same, but I learn something new every time that I hear that. I do know that our time is up, but I'm hoping folks can stay on for just a minute with some questions. So we had just one question in the chat box. And I put a couple things in there too. But so the question was, should parents allow their baby to cry if they need, or if they are fed, changed, and overall okay? I've heard letting a baby cry can cause trauma to the baby, as they are unable to process what is actually happening.
Okay, one thing I have learned, and I'm not trying to get out of this question, by the way, but one thing I have learned through this process is never pick parenting styles or talk about parenting styles, because there are differences of opinion. And really, where I'll go with that is this. We think a lot about sleep training in this instance. And I will tell you, children are amazingly resilient when they more often than not have access to responsive relationships. And so lots of parents do sleep training. There's not a lot of conclusive evidence that sleep training creates trauma or damages brain development. Right now, other people have other opinions, based on this science, but the data just doesn't pan out. And so what I mean to say by that is, if you do sleep training at night and then you are a nurturing, interactive parent all day long, or most of the day, none of us can do it all day long, especially in this pandemic. I'm a parent, I know. But more often than not, then kids are going to be great, and they're going to be able to build that important neural circuitry. What I would say is, during the day especially, respond as much as you can. If it means that you're going to get frustrated and yell or snap or something that you would never see yourself doing, because no parent ever sees themselves doing that, do walk away, okay? But if you have the capacity to respond and nurture and co-regulate, like even with your toddler that's throwing a temper tantrum just to sit on the floor and wait, the more you can do that, the better. There are some cases where you can't. Some cases you're like, get your shoes on. We got to get you to school. But when you can, try to do those things.
Yeah, I think, like you say, look at the overall picture, talk to professionals if you have questions, know your child, all those good things. Perfect. Another comment.
You can't spoil a baby. You can't overtouch or overnurture a baby. Okay, that's all I had to add.
That's true. So great information, they said. So, and I like to think about, I love the slide where ACEs is at the bottom of the pyramid and it goes up. So to me, I like to make the comparison with that, with our first, with the pillars, where healthy child development is the foundation. And so we need to think about which do we want as the foundation of what we're doing in our work. So let's be sure to do that. I want to show, so I don't see anything else in the chat. Does anybody, please, if you have another question or a comment to talk, please put it in there. I am going to pull up a slide to share information.
I got to give the shout out to my friend, Lori Hoffma. Hi, Lori. You're so sweet. She's only heard me give this presentation 5 million times and she still has something nice to say.
Well, I'm sure she's like me. Every time I hear it, like I said, I hear addition or learn something new or think of a different way. Right. So it's telling me I can't share my screen, Dan. Only the host or what? I'm a panelist, but I'm a panelist.
Yes, you are.
Let's see. Here we go. I got it now.
Okay, good.
Yep, I think so.
Yep.
Did it come up?
It's up. Yes.
Okay. And hopefully it doesn't have all these other things in front of it that I have. All right. So this coming Friday, we are, we as in, it's a group that started a knowledge mobilization of the work that is being done across the state. And we took the focus of children, so looking at children and families and the impact on community. So it dives in a little deeper, talks about some things specific to Rutherford County, but Patterson Park is working with us and has offered us an opportunity to do a virtual showing of a presentation that myself, Sarah Murphy, who's with the Rutherford County Coalition for Success, and Rachel Harrell, who's with the Child Care Resource and Referral Center. But the three of us put together the presentation that we're going to share and have a time for Q&A on that. The link is at the bottom here, and I'm going to put it in the chat too. It might be easier, or you might be able to copy and paste that. My contact information is on there as well. So if you want to reach out, if you have questions about the presentation, or if you're interested in having a presentation similar, I'm not sure if you all heard Jen say that we do have, or we as in TCCY has put together 15-minute presentations all the way up to 3-hour in-depth, and maybe an all day, I think, types of presentations. So if you're interested in getting more information for your organization or for your church or any other community group that you're involved with, please reach out. We will be more than happy to help support that. As part of our knowledge mobilization, we are going to be allowing folks times to watch the presentation and then have time for just discussions twice a month starting in February, and we're still confirming those dates. But and Jen has put her date in there. Somebody's asking if Friday's presentation will be recorded and shared later. And yes, Lori, we will have opportunities to do that. So.
And Connie, I will mention that we did record today's presentation too, so we can make that available as a resource as well.
Okay. Thank you. Well, I really appreciate your time, and Dan, I'll let you kind of close out if we don't have any other questions.
Thank you, Jen. Thank you so much. Such interesting, informative information. We sure appreciate your sharing and your willingness to continue the conversation. Thanks for sharing your email address. And again, Connie mentioned we're just now embarking on this activity here in the community for early childhood development, and certainly this sets a great foundation. So thanks everyone for attending, and we'll wrap it up. Thank you.